Ryan Grimm is the DC bureau chief for The Intercept. He is here to chat about his new piece out yesterday in The Intercept titled "Amy Coney Barrett's Take on Voting Rights on the Voting Rights Act Exposes Her Entire Legal Philosophy is a Lie." And you state in this piece, there was one line in particular that you said, quote, "Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, the top-ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, asked Barrett about the case Shelby versus Holder. In particular, she asked Barrett if she agreed with her mentor, Justice Antonin Scalia's conclusion that the act was a, quote, perpetuation of racial entitlement." So what does her record on voting say about her potential opinion of this moment, and then later the potential opinion of the Voting Rights Act, which could be gutted furthermore at the Supreme Court?
Well, philosophically, she lines up with Antonin Scalia quite squarely. And Scalia has been, thoroughly hostile to the idea of any federal oversight or any federal involvement in voting. The originalists believe quite firmly that voting is a state's issue, and if they were being entirely honest, because they can't, because there are some political boundaries that exist here. But if they were being entirely honest and pushing forward their originalist interpretation of the federal government's relationship with voting, they would allow states to ban women from voting, outside of the constitutional amendment, which they will acknowledge that if the Constitution has been itself amended, then that supersedes what the originalist intent was. But separate from that, they are really open to states putting in any restrictions that the states feel are legitimate, because they feel it's the state's right to set voting boundaries. When John Roberts gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, he said, this business of divvying up people by race is sordid. Earlier he had said, if you want to stop discriminating against people by race, stop discriminating against people by race. That was kind of like his entire sentence. And he said, the South has changed. Effectively, racism is over. And so you don't need this federal oversight anymore of voting laws in the South. Within hours of that ruling, Texas had put in voting restrictions. Like that's how quickly they moved, and the entire South, has kind of followed suit.
But is there any precedent? I mean, just that statement in itself from a justice is mind-blowing to me. That's like saying, let's get rid of our laws because they've protected enough people, so we don't need them anymore.
Right. I mean, you could say that if you don't need them anymore, what's the harm of, leaving them there? They're just sitting there. They're just sitting there on the books. It was an unusual law in the sense that it discriminated against particular states. The Voting Rights Act in 1965, when it passed, said that states that have a history of racial discrimination at the ballot box are going to be subject to harsher oversight than states that don't. That roughly coincided with states who had joined the Confederacy and states that were actively keeping black voters off of.
And part of that is because of Reconstruction,
so it's true that they were treated
Sorry. And part of that is because of Reconstruction, right?
Right. Yeah. So. Right. So during Reconstruction, and I mentioned this as an aside in my story, there's a kind of a sordid story there. There were the Republicans back then, Party of Lincoln, radical Republicans. Those were the ones that were fighting for black rights, for civil rights, and fighting to give the vote to black men in particular. There were a lot of Republicans who said we need to put the right to vote directly into the Constitution. No ifs, ands, or buts. Like if you're a man over the age of 21 at the time, then you have the right to vote, and no state can restrict or abridge your right. But other Republicans, moderate Republicans, you can call them, didn't want to do that because they're in their own self-interest. They wanted to suppress Chinese votes, and they wanted to suppress, in particular, Irish votes, because the Irish immigrants were voting heavily Democratic. And so they said, well, we'll just say that you can't restrict the vote on the basis of race. And so that's how they ended up writing that amendment. But what that means is that, well, you can restrict the vote by lots of other ways. And the Republicans devised ways to restrict it from the Irish and the Chinese, and the Democrats devised ways to restrict it from black voters in the South. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and when we say literacy test, that's a euphemism. It would, if a white voter came in, they'd ask him, what his name was, and that would be sufficient to vote. If a black voter came in, they'd have to, recite by word the entire Constitution, like beginning to end, or some other like completely like nearly impossible task. Though apparently some even succeeded in doing that because they would learn ahead of time what they had to memorize, and they would memorize it. But then also often they would be killed or attacked for passing the test. So in 1890 is when Republicans effectively gave up. They came within a couple votes of passing a bill that would have kind of forced the federal government back into oversight of black voting in the South. They fell short. Democrats ended up taking control again, and the blacks were driven from the voting booth until basically the 1930s or so, when they started voting for FDR again. So for 50 years they were kind of just completely written out of it.
So when Barrett talks about being an originalist or a textualist, I mean, can you, in the context of voting rights specifically and what you just discussed, what does that mean?
Right, and the reason I said it exposes her whole philosophy as a lie is that when Feinstein asked her about the Voting Rights Act, the way that Barrett characterized it was to say, well, this was a question over whether the pre-clearance coverage mandate was still appropriate, or the pre-clearance coverage calculation was still appropriate. And she deliberately used like extremely arcane language like that nobody could follow if they're not like a voting rights attorney. And what that basically means is that these particular states needed to have any changes they made to voting pre-cleared by the Justice Department. And so she's trying to say that this is what the whole thing turns on. And she said, well, look, maybe the statute needed to be updated from the 1960s. And that's where it got utterly absurd. Because if you listen to her definition of both originalism and textualism, it's that, oh, excellent. Thank you for finding that. It's that you, good. I'm glad you found it. It's that you don't update laws based on there being decades of intervention for centuries. If you're an originalist, centuries of time passing don't matter, and then it's not, the courts can't just go and update a statute because time has passed and they've put their finger in the wind and felt the political winds are blowing in a different direction. Whereas John Roberts said the South has changed. Like, that's abhorrent to their entire idea of originalism and textualism. But when it comes to the Voting Rights Act, she goes for it, and to do it, she lied further and didn't mention that in 2006, the Republican Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act after a multi-year-long negotiation between Democrats and Republicans that passed 98-0 in the Senate. It passed with more than 300 votes in the House, was signed into law in a big ceremony by George W. Bush. It was a big deal. So, the House and the Senate and the White House sat down, looked at the Voting Rights Act, updated it to 2006, and then we're told 7 years later by the Supreme Court that, oh, it's actually out of date. And so, the levels of lies were varied there, but the whole thing was shot through with kind of a fraudulent approach to the law.
Wouldn't this argument also apply to the ACA? Wouldn't it apply to gay marriage? Wouldn't it apply to abortion laws? I mean, a little bit back and forth with states, but if you're going to be an originalist, if you're going to, I mean, especially with gay marriage, if that's the game you want to play, then great, let's play it.
Originalism and textualism are results-oriented philosophies. They started with the things that they want, and they work backwards to find some meaning in the text of a statute or in the Federalist Papers somewhere, that they then claim supports the result that they want. When it doesn't support the result they want, they just toss the entire project out the window.
Okay, seems easy enough. But okay, that great logic.
Works. Yeah, it works for them.
Works for the right judges, exactly.
Yeah.
But on that note, this is a movement. This is a right-wing movement. You discuss this in the piece. She is a product, Roberts is a product of this right-wing movement to put conservative justices in who can use these arguments to justify their opinions. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.